Hey everybody. Today I had a sort of new, interesting idea I kind of wanted to talk about for today's video. Hopefully it'll come out succinctly and make sense to anyone watching this. But if you've watched a lot of my other stuff, you know I've put out a lot of guides involving builds, how to do this with this character and, some team comp guides and stuff. And I wanted to focus more on the sort of team building aspect. The part of that I want to focus on is how do you make a team? How do you know what you want to use in your team? I mean, first and foremost, obviously, whatever characters you have fun with. Whoever you think is fun, whoever you think is cool, that should be the biggest priority, I think. And I think the game is pretty well balanced where if you have a good understanding of the game and the mechanics, you could probably pull that off, even on very hard. But what if, you're not super experienced with the mechanics, but you're wanting to try out the higher difficulties, and you're having a little bit of difficulty with, some of the later stages of the game. You're not really sure how to beat some of these missions in a way that doesn't end up with your party being super messed up. And probably the biggest factor to that is your team composition. And there's definitely certain combinations of certain characters that I think will generally help a lot of players progress through the game easier, as opposed to some other combination. Well, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, you could probably beat the game with almost any combination of heroes. Maybe if you try something else, it'll be a bit easier until you get more used to the game, and then you can switch back to just using your favorites. So I'm going to sort of explain how I view each of the classes, what I think their roles are, how I look at them when I'm trying to do some team building, what I'm looking to, round out my teams and, push through the game. And hopefully by the end of this, some of you out there may have a better understanding of at least what I think the different classes may specialize in, and then with this information you can maybe help make a more well-rounded team. And I'll go over a little bit at the end, sort of some basic tips I think that may help you with getting your own sort of team building, theory crafting sort of stuff going. Now, before I get to the character specifically, there's going to be some terms I throw around that I've used a lot in my previous videos, so if you watch those, you will probably know what I mean by these already, even if I never explained them. A lot of them are probably pretty self-explanatory. But if this is someone's first time watching, welcome, and maybe some of this groundwork will help make sense some of the stuff I'm going to say without, having to explain everything as I go. There are sort of three main categories: main damage dealer, secondary damage dealer, and support. A main damage dealer or a primary damage dealer, this is the character in your team that's going to be getting the sort of bulk majority of the kills. They're going to be who you're feeding kills to because they'll have some sort of ability on their gear or their skill tree or a combination of them that gives them extra bonuses for getting kills. And they also are your highest damage dealer. So a lot of the time they'll be getting the kills on their own, but sometimes you may weaken a target to just let them get the killing blow because it'll help them move on to get more of the kills. As you get later into the game, they'll be doing huge sweeps, wiping out half of the enemy team or more in some cases. So they're kind of like your carry. A secondary damage dealer, as I like to reference it, is a character who their role is still to do damage and, lay down attacks against the enemy team, but they either just don't do quite as much damage as a primary damage dealer, so they're not really going to be getting a whole lot of kills because of that, or they don't have a lot of things in their gear or skill tree that incentivizes them to be the one to get the killing blow multiple times. Maybe once per turn they may get a bonus off of it, but it's not really enough to warrant feeding them a lot of kills. Or lastly, they may just not have the AP generation for it, where they can only throw out X number of attacks in a given turn, no matter what you do with them, so they'll never really be doing a whole lot of sweeping. This isn't to say that they're still not important, because as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you'll need help to feed kills to your primary damage dealer to keep their ball rolling. And the last category, support, this is probably the most broad of the categories, because this can mean a lot of things. The two main divides is either through buffing or debuffing. If you've played any RPG, I'm sure you know what the terms mean, either providing bonuses to your team or providing penalties to the enemy team. And then that's probably basically it. Those are the two main forms of support. There's like a little bit of a carve out for a class, but we'll kind of get to that when we get to it. I think that's all of the explanation and groundwork I needed to set. I've been kind of going for a bit, so let's just start getting into the class role explanations and breakdowns. To begin with, we'll start with the Defender class. This is the class that the main character is, Sir Mordred, so this is one class everyone is just going to have a pretty good amount of exposure to and experience with. Now, what is it a Defender brings to a team comp? First and foremost, it's their bulk. Defenders are by far and away the tankiest class in the game, where they can just take hit after hit and keep going, and it's not even close. The next one up is probably Champion, but Defenders have the block mechanic that just flat out reduces incoming damage. They are going to be your brick wall against the enemy forces. The role that they fill is support, and this support comes through their skills, such as things like Taunt and Guard. They provide protection to the rest of your party. They funnel attacks towards them because they can take them and free up your, other teammates to move unabated, unharassed, and move into positions to get their kills and lay down their damage. And this may not be in the form of providing any buffs or something, but tanking itself is support. It's not really buffing or debuffing, but it is valuable support. The more attacks you can funnel towards them, the healthier the rest of your team is, and then you don't need to sit anyone out at the hospice or the cathedral. Now, most tanks also do come with buffing capability. There are defenders such as Percival and Galahad, some of the strongest defenders in the game, that have very powerful buffing abilities. However, there are also other defenders that provide debuffing capabilities, like the Red Knight and Mordred. Mordred and the Red Knight don't have the powerful taunting capabilities that a lot of the other defenders have, so they're much more reliant on positioning. If you position your heroes well enough, and this just comes with game knowledge, you can actually funnel a lot of attacks towards your defenders, like Mordred, without needing to taunt. And that in combination with his debuffing skills, such as Chain Lightning and Thunderbolt, it can really just help suppress the enemy's actions, so that way the amount of attacks they're putting out in the first place won't be as high. So the attacks that do go towards Mordred won't be quite as many, and the attacks that don't go towards him and go towards the rest of your teammates also ideally won't be as many. So to summarize, defenders are support. Whether it's through buffing or debuffing, they provide protection to the party, and if you're struggling with survivability, having a defender in your party will actually do a lot to help boost that. You get good at funneling attacks towards them, either with positioning as a debuff defender, or through taunt that most of the buffing defenders have. And I think you'll notice a lot of your characters will be spending less time in the hospice and the cathedral. Next, I'm going to talk about Arcanists, probably one of the strongest classes, I think, in the game. What is it that makes the Arcanists so good? What do they contribute to their party? Well, they are ranged, which is very, very powerful at pretty much all stages of the game. It makes them a more low-risk unit, but they provide exceptional debuffing capability and support through their spells. On top of that, they also operate as secondary damage dealers. Every single Arcanist, except for Merlin, has hexes, which are just very strong, powerful debuffs, plus all of them then have their own unique skills, which pretty much all happen to come with debuffs on top of that. Merlin, while he doesn't have hexes, he fits the exact same role. All of his unique abilities come in the form of damage and debuffs. That's just what the Arcanist thing is. And you can see here, for example, on Morgana, she has Slowing Hex and Blood Hex. This reduces enemy damage that they deal. Slowing Hex slows them so they can, either not reach you or not be able to reach you and attack in the same turn. Blood Hex also provides a bleed. Glacial Strike provides a chill or a freezing effect with an upgrade. Ice Thorns is a 4x4 freezing effect. Ice Wall provides barriers to prevent and help hamper the enemy's approach on you in the same way as Slowing Hex does. She has Ice Spikes, which can be upgraded to also chill, and she has Death Hex, which is really where a huge chunk of their contribution as a secondary damage dealer comes from. Arcanists work very well to help set up the enemies for your primary damage dealer to come in and just absolutely rinse through them. As you can see, all of these debuffs weaken the enemy, keep them from reaching you, or when they do reach you, they just don't deal as much damage or get as many attacks out. They have high range, so they can also be hitting the enemies from afar as they approach, lowering their health for your melee to then finish them. And Death Hex is the ultimate enabler. It removes a huge chunk of vitality, 30% at base, which increases with Hex intensity to being, half of their vitality or more, making it that much easier to just one-tap the enemy, and then your main damage dealer can keep on going. The Arcanist is the ultimate setup unit, basically. They throw all kinds of spells around, thanks to Mindstorm, just weakening enemies across the board in so many different ways, doing damage as well in most cases with their offensive spells that double as debuffing most of the time. And they're all doing this from afar, too, so they're super safe 9 times out of 10. So if you're looking for a character that can help diminish the enemies while also damaging them at the same time to help set up stronger combos or sweeps for your primary damage dealer, then the Arcanist is really gonna be the fit for you. Third, I'm gonna cover the Sages. And the Sages are a pretty straightforward class. Their primary role in every team is going to be support. Buffing support, to be more precise. They have extremely powerful buffing abilities, such as Inspire and Bless. These are basically their signature iconic moves that they're going to be using in every single fight, pretty early on too, a lot of the time. Sages do provide some debuffing capabilities, so I'm not ignoring that, but it's not as strong as their buffing capability. That is what you are bringing the Sage for. If you really want to help increase the performance of your other party members, like let's say you have 3 party members that you think are just really kicking a lot of ass, they're doing great, but sometimes they may just be a little bit short from being able to get that extra kill or just deal that extra damage to secure a kill. A Sage is probably going to be the pick for you. With their ability to add extra AP to the rest of the team and provide extra damage to your primary damage dealer, one of your melees, you'll probably find yourself getting an extra kill or just doing enough damage to get a kill in the first place. All of a sudden, maybe you're one-tapping enemies. Sages is a great pick for that. There isn't really a whole lot much else to them. They do deal some moderate damage. It's not to say that, their damage is completely inconsequential, but I don't think they really do enough in most cases to really warrant being classified as a secondary damage dealer. If you're looking for someone to contribute damage on their own, like that damage is what they're bringing to the table rather than enabling damage for others, you're probably better off looking towards other sources to get that. The Sage can do all right, but again, pretty much their whole shtick is buffing support, and they do it very, very well. If you want to get a Sage that maybe, I would say, leans more as a secondary damage dealer as well as providing that buffing support, it'd probably be Lucan and Guinevere. If you spec out their skill trees in certain ways, I think they can probably take on that second role for them as well. Moving on to the next class, though, this time I'm going to cover Champions. And Champions have one role in the party, and that is the primary damage dealer. If you're looking for a class that is good at dealing AoE damage, just wiping out groups of enemies at a time, and just mowing their way through the enemy team, that's what the champion's for. Their sort of take on the damage dealer role compared to their compatriot, which we'll get to later, is that they specialize a lot more in AoE. They won't be able to go from kill to kill single target very well because a lot of their moves are very AP expensive, minimum of 4, and they can only get a refund of 2 at most if you're using an essence. So they won't really be able to go from kill to kill if you're just taking out one enemy at a time. What you need to be looking for with them is getting a lot of kills for as little AP as possible. So that means with your Earthshakers trying to get 2-3 kills at any given time, never really settling for 1. If you're using Cleave, trying to get 2-3 kills. With Leap Attack, 2-3 kills. And then, you still have things like Power Attack and your regular strike if there's just, a very heavy, bulky unit with a lot of health, and you can use that to try and, one-tap him. They get upgrades later that'll help them get free swings on enemies, so that way you get a lot more AoE potential from all of your moves. And as they get more and more kills, their damage just starts to accelerate because of their rage ability, and they'll eventually start running around basically one-tapping everything. That is what your main damage dealer is supposed to be doing, one-shotting or at most two-shotting enemies as much as possible. But because that requires them to get kills in the first place, this is where that secondary damage dealer role really comes into play that I mentioned earlier. Having a strong secondary damage dealer, like an Arcanist, to help get a champion's ball rolling will prove extremely important. So to just sort of summarize, if you want a damage dealer with a theoretically infinite damage cap and really specializes in killing groups of enemies at a time, then the champion's probably the one you're going to want to go with, as long as you're fine with them maybe relying on a second damage dealer to kind of get things started for them. Moving on to the other primary damage dealer, Vanguards. Vanguards are a very simple, straightforward class. They just go into stealth and then run around stabbing everything in the back, dealing as much damage as possible. In contrast to champions, they aren't really that great at AoE kills. Boudica here has Flurry, but that's it. Most other Vanguards in general don't have any AoE, and the ones that do, like Tristan, it is not a damage-dealing move. They specialize at basically going from target to target, taking them down one by one by one. And they can do this very efficiently because they can actually get completely full AP refunds with the Essence, which means they spend 3 AP on an attack, and if they get the kill, they get 3 back, so they can just keep on going. If you don't use the Essence, they get 2 out of 3, which is still an extremely high return rate. Additionally, in contrast to champions, they are much stronger out of the gate. They don't rely on a secondary damage dealer nearly as much because they have high damage on the first kill just as much on the last kill. Their damage doesn't really ramp up and it starts at a much higher point. However, if you're playing on the higher difficulties and you reach, later stages of the game, Act 4, endgame, you'll start running into enemies with, like 2,000 health. They're not going to be able to one-shot that. So at that point, either you're going to have to sink a couple attacks into them, or start to rely on your secondary damage dealers a bit more to try and keep their kills as efficient as possible, because that's always the goal with either type of primary damage dealer, as efficient kills as possible, spending as little AP per kill as you can try to manage. If you want a highly mobile damage dealer that's going to be pretty much never taking damage and can just out of the gate start, really one-shotting and just tearing apart enemy teams, but may struggle a little more with higher health targets, then Vanguard is going to be a consideration to put into your team, and you really can't go wrong with a Vanguard. And the last class on the list is going to be the Marksmen. The Marksmen are kind of in a tricky spot right now, as I'm sure a lot of players know, especially ones that may have been watching me for a little bit. They're not really great right now. So, practically speaking, the role they fill in most teams is no role at all, because if you're playing on higher difficulties, once you get past Act 1, my genuine recommendation, if you're having trouble with some team building, is to just avoid using them. If you are currently using one and you seem to be doing fine, then that's awesome. Happy to hear it. But for a lot of other players out there, if you're struggling and you feel like your team isn't really performing adequately and you're currently using a marksman, honestly, if you swap out that marksman for someone else, pretty much anyone else, I do think you'll probably notice an increase in performance. Once you get to the end game and use the Soul Merchant, as I've shown off before, they become fairly competent. But that's sort of a niche thing, and I'm not really gonna go into that. That's a whole separate topic, and doesn't really change the role that I feel they fill in. And that role is secondary damage dealer. They are a ranged unit, and from what I can tell based on their skill tree design, they seem like the intention is to be a higher damage secondary damage dealer ranged option to contrast against the Arcanist. The Arcanist maybe not having as good damage as the Marksman, but it has a bunch of support utility in the form of debuffing and its hexes. You can tell the Marksman has a little bit of debuffing. A lot of them have some, like unique abilities, like the Smothering Shot here for boars, where they have some debuffing, but none of them have enough where I think they would earn the support role. They are strictly a secondary damage dealer. Now, because of that, that just kind of makes their low performance, their low damage right now, feel a bit worse. So, if you really like a marksman, hang on to one so that we can give them the Soul Merchant armor in the endgame, and then they will actually turn into a very strong secondary damage dealer. They will definitely out-damage the Arcanist counterpart, but the debuffing still is nowhere close in comparison. They have this one role, and they can become good at it if you sit on a marksman super long, but if you don't want to do that, I would just avoid the class in general right now for your team building. And that wraps up all of the class overviews. I know there's some characters for each class that doesn't really sort of fit the mold entirely, like Fairy Knight and Lancelot, but I'm just kind of going over this from a sort of broad general point of view for anyone that's just trying to get started. If you guys are interested in me going into those characters and the roles they fill and how I think they could work into team building, I can definitely go into that for another video. Next up, I'm going to give just a quick TLDR for anyone that, maybe didn't want to sit through all my long-winded explanations. Here's going to be the little timestamp I cut out for the video for those people. The Defender class is going to be providing a support class through its own unique form of support in terms of tankiness, funneling attacks into themselves, and sparing the rest of your party. They're a very strong support class in that way. On top of that, some of them get buffing abilities, others get debuffing abilities. Which one you want to go with will depend on what alignment you pick and kind of what playstyle you prefer. Arcanists fill the roles of support and secondary damage dealer. They provide support through debuffing. All of them have very strong kits to debuff the enemy and control the battlefield and hamper the enemy. On top of that, they all have a wide variety of different damaging spells, which they can hit from very high ranges to weaken the enemies as they approach you, therefore allowing your primary damage dealers to then come in and more easily sweep them, get one-shots more easily, things like that. The Sage class, as a whole, is just going to be your sort of standard support, more specifically, buffing support. With their Inspire and Bless abilities, they will help elevate your team if you're looking to just amplify your other party members. You maybe have 2 or 3 that you think are just kind of carrying everything and you want to make them stronger. The Sage is probably where you want to go. Champion is going to be one of the 2 primary damage dealer classes. They're going to be funneling a lot of kills into this class. They're going to be a little more reliant on that secondary damage dealer, but they're very good at getting just groups of kills off of singular skills and can reach super high damage ceilings to potentially one-shot enemies even in the endgame. Vanguard is going to be the other primary damage dealer class. They are much more mobile. They have nearly no AoE, but are much more efficient in single target kills, going from target to target, and will require much less support from a secondary damage dealer for most enemies, but for the heavier ones, they're probably going to need a bit more support from your secondary damage dealers when it comes to them. And then finally, Marksmen. They are also a secondary damage dealer class, but a ranged version, and for the most of the game, just are not strong enough in that role to really warrant taking. So if you're trying to do some team building, I would probably shy away from that one until you reach the end game, and only if you're really a fan of the Marksman playstyle. Now, what are going to be my overall recommendations, tips, whatever you want to call it, for beginning your own team building and your theory crafting for that? If you're really struggling with performance-wise and you're trying to put something together, this is sort of my general advice to act as a starting point, and as you kind of develop your playstyle further, understand the game more, you can then customize it a bit more from this. And obviously this will vary depending on your alignment. This is just speaking in broad strokes. I think picking a defender for one of your slots, you cannot go wrong with that. It's a very strong class, a very safe class, super hard to kill, and they really help open up windows for the rest of your party to do what you want to do with them. Either a debuffing or buffing defender, you can't go wrong with either. It's a very strong backbone to any team. And then, of course, you're going to want to pick up a primary damage dealer, champion, or Vanguard. Doesn't really matter. Whichever class playstyle you like more, go with that one. It doesn't really change a whole lot. And for the final two spots, you're probably going to want support. Now, if you're doing champion, probably going to want to pick up a secondary damage dealing character to fill in for one of these support slots, as there are a number of support characters that also double as secondary damage dealers. Some of the sages, and pretty much all of the Arcanists. Now, depending on your alignment, this will determine what support options you have available to you. For example, if you're doing Rightful Christian, they're both going to be buffing. If you're doing Tyrant Old Faith, they're both going to be debuffing. But if you're going Rightful Old Faith or Tyrant Christian, you will actually have selection to buffing and debuffing with both of those combinations. So either pick 2 buffing, pick 2 debuffing, one of each. Doesn't really matter ultimately. You'll kind of figure out which one you like more, and you may probably end up doubling up on that. But as long as you have 2 support going in, you're going to be good. And between the 2 of them, if you're not taking a dedicated secondary damage dealer like an Arcanist, maybe you want to run 2 sages, you'll probably be fine with that. The biggest important starting point, though, really to focus on is defender, primary damage dealer, and then 2 support of really any kind. Now, this isn't to say this is the only team comp that can work, but I have found that this is just sort of the easiest and simplest starting point, especially for players that may be struggling performance-wise on the higher difficulties moving into the later stages of the game. I hope this was helpful to everyone watching, and it made sense, and I was able to explain myself adequately. If anyone has any questions, things weren't, completely clear on some things, please feel free to ask me in the comments. I love being able to interact with you guys, answering any questions as that comes up. But that is going to be it for this video. If you made it to the end, thank you, and I hope to see you in the next one.